The family and the state. Early Zhou political philosophy, as represented in the Classic of Odes and the Classic of Documents, centered on moral justification for political authority based on the doctrine of the mandate of heaven tianming. This view was that the sage's virtue attracted the attention of the anthropomorphized cosmic power, usually translated as heaven tian, which supported the sage's rise to political authority. These canonical texts argued that political success or failure is a function of moral quality, evidenced by actions such as proper ritual performance on the part of the ruler. Confucius drew on these classics and adapted the classical view of moral authority in important ways, connecting it to a normative picture of society. Positing a parallel between the nature of reciprocal responsibilities of individuals in different roles in two domains of social organization. In the Analects, Confucius linked filial piety in the family to loyalty in the political realm. It is rare for a person who is filially pious to his parents and older siblings to be inclined to rebel against his superiors. Filial piety to parents and elder siblings may be considered the root of a person. This section examines Confucius's social and political philosophy, beginning with the central role of his analysis of the traditional norm of filial piety. Just as Confucius analyzed the psychology of ritual performance and related it to individual moral development, his discussion of filial piety was another example of the development and adaptation of a particular classical cultural pattern to a wider philosophical context and set of concerns. Originally limited to descriptions of sacrifice to ancestors in the context of hereditary kinship groups, a more extended meaning of filial piety was used to describe the sage King Shun's trad. 225-62205 BC treatment of his living father in the Classic of Documents. Despite humble origins, Shun's filial piety was recognized as a quality that signaled he would be a suitable successor for the sage King Yao trad. R. 235-72256 BCE. Confucius in the Analects praised the ancient sage kings at great length, and the sage King Yu for his filial piety in the context of sacrifice. However, he used the term filial piety to mean both sacrificial mastery and behaving appropriately to one's parents. In a conversation with one of his disciples, he explains that filial piety meant not 1-2, contesting, and that it entailed, while one's parents were alive, serving them in a ritually proper way, and after one's parents died, burying them and sacrificing to them in a ritually proper way. In rationalizing the moral content of legacies of the past, like the 3-year mourning period after the death of a parent, Confucius reasoned that for 3 years a filially pious child should not alter a parent's way, and explains the origin of length of the 3-year mourning period to be the length of time that the parents had given their infant child support. This adaptation of filial piety to connote the proper way for a gentleman to behave both inside and outside the home was a generalization of a pattern of behavior that had once been specific to the family. Intellectual historian Chen Lai has identified 2 sets of ideal traits that became hybridized in the late Warring States period. The first set of qualities describes the virtue of the ruler coming out of politically oriented descriptions of figures like King Wen of Zhou, including uprightness Ji and fortitude Gang. The second set of qualities is based on bonds specific to kinship groups, including filial piety and kindness Sai. As kinship groups were subordinated to larger political units, texts began to exhibit hybrid lists of ideal qualities that drew from both sets. Consequently, Confucius had to effectively integrate clan priorities and state priorities, a conciliation illustrated in Han's intertextual commentary The Odes by his insistence that filial piety is not simply deference to elders. When his disciple Xingxi submitted to a severe beating from his father's staff in punishment for an offense, Confucius chastises Xingxi, saying that even the sage King Shun would not have submitted to a beating so severe. He goes on to explain that a child has a dual set of duties to both a father and ruler, the former filial piety and the other loyalty. Therefore, protecting one's body is a duty to the ruler and a counterweight to a duty to submit to one's parent. In the Classic of Filial Piety Shaojing, similar reasoning is applied to a redefinition of filial piety that rejects behaviors like such extreme submission, because protecting one's body is a duty to one's parents. This sort of qualification suggests that as filial piety moved further outside its original family context, it had to be qualified to be integrated into a view that valorized multiple character traits. Since filial piety was based on a fundamental relationship defined within the family, one's family role and state role could conflict. A Classic of Documents text spells out the possible conflict between loyalty to a ruler and filial piety toward a father, tianming, a trade-off similar to a story in the Analects about a man named Zhou upright Gong, who testified that his father stole a sheep. Although Confucius acknowledged that theft injures social order, he judged upright Gong to have failed to be truly upright in a sense that balances the imperative to testify with special consideration for members of his kinship group. In my circle, being upright differs from this. A father would conceal such a thing on behalf of his son, and a son would conceal it on behalf of his father. Uprightness is found in this. In this way, too, Confucius was adapting filial piety to a wider manifold of moral behaviors, owning his answer to the question of how a child balances responsibility to family and loyalty to the state. While these two traits may conflict with one another, sociologist Robert Bellah, in his study of Tokugawa and modern Japan, noted how the structural similarity between loyalty and filial piety led to their both being promoted by the state as interlinked ideals that located one to each person in dual networks of responsibility. Confucius was making this claim when he connected filial piety to the propensity to be loyal to superiors. Statements like filial piety is the root of virtuous action from the Classic of Filial Piety connect loyalty and the kind of action that signals the personal virtue that justifies political authority, as in the historical precedent of the sage King Shun. Of the classical sources from which Confucius drew, two were particularly influential in discussions of political legitimation. The Classic of Odes consists of 305 Zhou period regulated lyrics, hence the several translation songs, odes, or poems, and became numbered as one of the 5 classics Wujing in the Han Dynasty. Critical to a number of these lyrics is the celebration of King Wen of Zhou's overthrow of the Shang, which is an example of a virtuous person seizing the mandate of heaven. This King Wen of ours, his prudent heart was well ordered. He shone in serving the high God, and thus enjoyed much good fortune. Unswerving in his virtue, he came to hold the domains all around, tianming. The Zhou political theory expressed in this passage is based on the idea of a limited moral universe that may not reward a virtuous person in isolation, but in which the high god Shangdi, Dai or heaven, will intercede to replace a bad ruler with a person of exceptional virtue. The Classic of Documents is a collection that includes orations attributed to the sage rulers of the past and their ministers, and its arguments often concern moral authority with a focus on the methods and character of exemplary rulers of the past. The chapter Announcement of Kang Kangao is addressed to one of the sons of King Wen, and provides him with a guide for behaving as sage ruler as well as with methods that had been empirically proven successful by those rulers. When it comes to the mandate inherited from King Wen, the chapter insists that the mandate is not unchanging, and so as ruler the son must always be mindful of it when deciding how to act. Further, it is not always possible to understand heaven, but the feelings of the people are visible, and so the ruler must care for his subjects. The Zhou political view that Confucius inherited was based on supernatural intercession to place a person with personal virtue in charge of the state, but over time the emphasis shifted to the way that the effects of good government could be viewed as proof of a continuing moral justification for that placement. Confucius himself arguably served as a historical counterexample to the classical mandate of heaven theory, calling into question the direct nature of the support given by heaven to the person with virtue. The Han period records of the historian biography of Confucius described him as possessing all the personal qualities needed to govern well, but wandering from state to state because those qualities had not been recognized. When his favorite disciple died, the Analects records Confucius saying that heaven has forsaken me. Wang Chong's 27-C.97 CE Balanced Discussions Lunheng uses the phrase uncrowned King Suang to describe the tragic situation. Confucius did not rule as king, but his work as uncrowned king may be seen in the Spring and Autumn Annals. The view that through his writings Confucius could prepare the world for the government of a future sage king became a central part of Confucius lore that has colored the reception of his writings since, especially in works related to the Spring and Autumn Annals and its Gongyang commentary. The biography of Confucius reinforced the tragic cosmological picture that personal virtue did not always guarantee success. Even when heaven's support is cited in the Analects, it is not a matter of direct intercession, but expressed through personal virtue or cultural patterns. Heaven gave birth to the virtue in me, so what can Huan Tui do to me? As Robert Eno has pointed out, the concept of heaven also came to be increasingly naturalized in passages like "What need does heaven have to speak?" Changing views of the scope of heaven's activity and the ways human beings may have knowledge of that activity fostered a change in the role of heaven in political theory. Most often in dialogues with the rulers of his time, references to heaven were occasions for Confucius to encourage rulers to remain attentive to their personal moral development and treat their subjects fairly. In integrating the classical legacy of the mandate of heaven that applied specifically to the ruler or son of heaven Tianzi, with moral teachings that were directed to a wider audience, the nature of heaven's intercession came to be understood differently. In the Analects and writings like those attributed to Mencius, descriptions of virtue were often adapted to contexts such as the conduct of lesser officials and the navigation of everyday life. Kwong Loishun notes that in such contexts, the influence of heaven remained as an explanation of both what happened outside of human control, like political success or lifespan, and of the source of the ethical ideal. In the Analects, the gentleman's awe of heaven is combined with an awe of the words of the sages. And when Confucius explains the Zhou theory of the mandate of heaven, in the Elder Dai's records of ritual, he does so in order to explain how the signs of a well-ordered society demonstrate that the ruler's virtue matches heaven's Shaojian. Heaven is still ubiquitous in the responses of Confucius to questions from rulers. But the focus of the responses was not on heaven's direct intercession, but rather the ruler's demonstration of his personal moral qualities. In this way, personal qualities of modesty, filial piety, or respect for the elders were seen as proof of fitness to serve in an official capacity. Qualification to rule was demonstrated by proper behavior in the social roles defined by the 5 relationships Wulin, a formulation seen in the writings of Mencius that became a key feature of the interpretation of works associated with Confucius in the Han Dynasty. The Western Han emperors were members of the Liu clan, and works like the Guliang commentary Guliang Xuan to the Spring and Autumn Annals emphasized normative family behavior grounded in the 5 relationships, which were here adapted to include mothers and sisters, ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, siblings and friends. Writing with particular reference to the classic of filial piety, Henry Rosemont and Roger Ames argue that prescribed social roles are a defining characteristic of the Confucian tradition, and that such roles were normative guides to appropriate conduct. They contrast this with the virtue ethics approach they say requires rational calculation to determine moral conduct, while filial piety is simply a matter of meeting one's family obligations. Just as the 5 virtues were placed at the center of later theories of moral development, once social roles became systematized in this way, selected situational teachings of Confucius consistent with them could become the basis of more abstract, systematic moral theories. Yet this could not have happened without the adaptation of the abstract classical political theory of heaven's mandate, a doctrine that originally supported the ruling clan, to argue that heaven's influence was expressed through particular concrete expressions of individual virtue. As a result of this adaptation in writings associated with Confucius, the ruler's conduct of imperial rituals, performance of filial piety, or other demonstrations of personal virtue provided proof of moral fitness that legitimated his political authority. As with the rituals and the virtues, filial piety and the mandate of heaven were transformed as they were integrated with the classics through the voices of Confucius and the rulers and disciples of his era. Earlier, the usage of Confucius as a metonym for Chinese traditional culture was introduced as a feature of the modern period. Yet the complexity of the philosophical views associated with Confucius encompassing ethical ideals developed out of a sophisticated view of the effects of ritual and music on the performer's psychology, robust descriptions of the attitudes of traditional exemplars across diverse contexts, and the abstraction of normative behaviors in the family and state is due in part to the fact that this metonymic usage was to some degree already the case in the Han period. By that time, the teachings of Confucius had gone through several centuries of gestation, and dialogues and quotations fashioned at different points over that time circulated and mixed. Put slightly differently, Confucius read the traditional culture of the Halcyon Zhou period in a particular way, but this reading was continuously reflected and refracted through different lenses during the pre- and pre-emperor phase, prior to the results being fixed in diverse early imperial period sources like the Analects, the records of ritual, and the records of writ the historian. What remains is the work of the hand of Confucius, but also of his school, and even sometimes of his opponents during the centuries that his philosophy underwent elaboration and drift. This process of accretion and elaboration is not uncommon for pre-modern writings, and the resulting breadth and depth explains, at least in part, why the voice of Confucius retained primacy in pre-modern Chinese philosophical conversations, as well as in many modern debates about the role of traditional East Asian culture. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below with your thoughts or any questions you have. Your feedback helps us create better content for you. See you in the next video.